The lights stay on because of systems most people never think about. Programmable logic controllers, remote telemetry units, historians, HMIs. This is a sprawling, aging infrastructure that keeps power flowing across North America. And for decades, security wasn't always part of the plan. It didn't need to be. These systems, they were isolated, air-gapped, and invisible to the outside world. Well, that world is gone. Today, artificial intelligence can accelerate reconnaissance, map unfamiliar OT environments, and help architect a targeted attack faster than any human team could. And if that environment happens to live in the cloud, then a single stolen credential isn't just the keys to the kingdom. It hands over the entire kingdom. Meanwhile, the defenders, they're drowning. Security teams already working through queues of thousands of unpatched vulnerabilities just got handed even more, courtesy of AI-powered research tools like Claude Mythos and Glasswing. The triage problem alone is enough to break any organization. So what is the industry doing about it? NERC's new CIP 15 standard is pushing internal network monitoring deeper into OT environments, all the way down to the device level. It's a meaningful step, but as my guest today points out, you can check every single compliance box and still have no real visibility, no real security. He calls it compliance theater. This is a story about how AI is rewriting the OT attack playbook. And with cloud exposure and flooded CVE queues, the energy sector's defenses face a reckoning, and new regulations alone won't save them. I'm Robert Vamosi. This is Error Code.
Hi, I'm Jori VanAntwerp, CEO and founder of Ember OT. Ember OT is the next evolution in industrial cybersecurity tools. We're designed to install nearly anywhere and provide you with insight and visibility throughout Purdue levels 1 through 3.5.
You may recall my guest from episode 14 when he helped deconstruct various Hollywood myths about taking down the electrical grid in North America. As we record this episode, Claude Mythos is top of mind. This is the AI model from Anthropic that can find vulnerabilities in minutes, not hours or days, within software and firmware. Fortunately, not all of the vulnerabilities can be exploited. Yet, it might be possible that some offensive AI could come up with enough vulnerabilities to actually get lucky, even with OT systems.
If you give it enough data, yes. You could. AI is going to make all of this faster, whether it's hacking, whether it's the vulnerability research or everything in between. It's all of those things can be made faster. Again, if you know the foundations and you know the tool, it's an amazing tool. It can make you faster at anything.
And I should mention that there are other models out there that can do this as well. It's just that Claude Mythos was the first, and so the industry has started to say that we're now living in a post-Mythos vulnerability world. Clearly, it's a huge headache for IT systems. It's also a headache for OT as well. For years, I have said that the complexity of OT, different RTOS and different chipsets, made it somewhat safe. Security by obscurity. Now, since the time required and the costs incurred in finding and exploiting new vulnerabilities are significantly lower, what about that offensive scenario where I could train an AI on a particular OT system, knowing about its unique software and firmware?
It's the same thing that real adversaries that are targeting OT environments do today. Reconnaissance is number one. It's going in, collecting as much information about that specific system, because each one of these locations, I think we talked about this in the last episode, each one of those locations is a work of art. They're all unique, right? So you're going to have to go in and do your reconnaissance, each one of those locations, to understand how it works. Then you can take that context, and if you can actually identify the assets in the environment down to the level that some tools do, then yes, AI could absolutely help you one, process that information to identify those assets, and two, actually help you architect an attack for that particular environment. And it could do it much faster than humans, but it's not the workflow that changes. It just speeds up.
So the best defense is having these basics in there, having the security controls that can compensate for these attacks in the moment. Having a great asset inventory really helps.
It does. And there's a couple things that I think are important. So Operation Glasswing, when it launched, had no operation technology systems in it at all. There were no partners for it. So we saw a lot of talk about how this is it's just going to completely change how OT security is done. It's hard to say that because it was specifically excluded due to difficulties of how many different firmware versions there are running in the wild right now and all these other technical constraints. That changed. I want to say, I know Hitachi, so Nozomi, Tenable, and Dragos are now working with Operation Glasswing. So we'll start to see some of that information. But again, those aren't the vendors. Those are OT security tools, right? So I'll be interested to see how it really affects the environment.
Again, with AI making the reconnaissance faster, having your configuration and environment in the cloud makes it much, much easier for an attacker. That's assuming these AI models can produce exploitable vulnerabilities. Having a list of AI-based vulnerabilities is daunting. However, not all of the open source libraries, even if they show up in a hardware or software bomb, are going to be running. There's a lot of dormant files that are simply unreachable.
Maybe this would be a good example. There is a known exploit. Forgive me, I don't remember the CVE off the top of my head for GIMP. GIMP is a open source graphic editor, kind of like Photoshop. It's also used in a lot of applications. There is a particular version of an HMI that is running on Windows XP that has an older version of GIMP. GIMP is utilized to create the little icons, right, that you're placing inside the actual software and operation. You've got these pre-cut or pre-boxed icons are in the background. GIMP never actually runs in its native way. It's just referencing files that were created by GIMP, if that makes sense. But GIMP is technically on that system. Can the HMI, can like the asset owner do anything with that? No, they can't access it at all. So the question is, vulnerability wise, does that even apply? Is it technical versus real world, right? Technically, yes, I guess it's on the system. If you could get to it somehow, you'd have to exploit something else in the system to get to that vulnerability. It would be like a nested thing. I think that's what you're kind of laying out is how do we look for that? And unfortunately, as far as I know, because of the lack of endpoint technology that we like that Windows XP, I don't know anybody who supports XP from like an endpoint detection and response stance anymore. We just don't have the endpoint side to be able to really see that. If you had an endpoint agent on there, you could, if it's more modern and you can have an endpoint agent, you could very easily see if that was accessible or reasonable, or like you said, you could execute it at all. When it comes to these though, these types of systems like that HMI, you would have to wait until a maintenance window and either an operator or an analyst from that company or a consultant would need to come in and do a quick forensic analysis on the box to understand if it was available. The vendor might have knowledge of that, but they also make so many different solutions. I wouldn't put them on the spot, or I would be understanding if they didn't know off the top of their head.
And then there's the scenario where the configuration may be different than what's expected. There are these features included. And again, I'm thinking of firmware and the firmware libraries such as like Modbus. They weren't executed because they weren't implemented. These devices, they might get flagged as vulnerable when in fact they're not.
You're absolutely right. And to even go beyond that, we've seen this, luckily not as much recently, but at one point there's a very famous CVE for Modbus not having authentication. That's not a vulnerability. That was a design feature. That's a design choice. Yes, it doesn't have any authentication. It was designed to never have any authentication. Who's going to patch Modbus? How are we supposed to get past this, guys? You guys are making it a little difficult. And you do see CVEs that pop up like that. Luckily, OT security the community itself has grown so much in the last 5 years that we're seeing more and more understanding around that. So we don't see quite as blatant things like that. But we still do see vulnerabilities that come along that specify things that, if you know the environment, would be not a, it doesn't apply. This is pivoting a little, but recently a company that I advise in OT came up with an idea for a blog article. And this was a young intern that was interning over the summer, came up with an idea for a blog article and pitched it. And it was how to choose the best OS for OT. Being in OT for so long, and I'm sure you have the same response, you don't get to pick your OS. Right. That's not your choice. That comes down to the vendor, but it's little things like just lack of understanding. You come from a computerized world and you think IT, well, yeah, what's the best OS that I could defend in my OT environment? Well, it's a great thing to talk about, but realistically, highly unlikely that you have any say in that. It turned into a great conversation, but I think what you've outlined as well, in it not being executable, it not being an actual vulnerability, like the Modbus example, I'm going to flat out say that's not a vulnerability. Those things do pop up, and you need someone with some expertise to understand and go through that. Even with AI can't replace that level of thinking yet. I'm sure someone will argue with me on that, but I'm glad to take that argument. To segue a little bit into what we're seeing with AI, Mythos, Glasswing, et cetera. Vulnerabilities have it's not that we can't find the vulnerabilities. That's never been the issue. The issue is actually executing on that, mitigating them in some way, patching them, et cetera. And the piece that never gets talked about between those two is the actual triage. What do I do first? What's next? How do I even sort through this? So I see it almost broke my heart when Mythos and Glasswing came out, and we started just seeing these massive upticks in vulnerabilities because these guys already have a queue of 8,000 vulnerabilities they're trying to patch. You just gave them 10 more. Whew.
So there's another aspect to vulnerabilities. How severe are the vulnerabilities? They cut across everything, not just IT, but OT as well. And I've often found that with OT, the CVSS scores are, well, they penalize a device in very interesting ways. Maybe that's changed since I haven't really seen the latest scoring.
They have made adjustments to it, but if I'm honest, it's not. It's more useful in an IT setting than it is in an OT setting. CVSS scores don't take into account the things that are most important in that environment. Earlier I said that the base is segmentation and understanding what's in your environment, visibility. A properly segmented environment, when it comes to vulnerabilities, can actually mitigate a lot of risk. As well, just because we know there's a vulnerability, there may not be an ability to patch it. I talk often, this is outside of OT, but about OT, is the fact that in many cases, they don't own that environment the way that an IT person would. So that maintenance and service contracts are involved. And so they may, even if there is a patch available, the vendor, the OEM, may not allow them to put that patch in because it breaks their maintenance contract. So there are a lot of different questions that we can ask ourselves. And we actually created something at my company called the 5 Lenses. That's just a simple walkthrough process to help with that, because I don't think that, I shouldn't say that I don't think, I categorically know CVSS score does not translate to prioritization and risk in an OT environment. It doesn't take the things that we consider into account. Has this actually ever been utilized? Meaning, is it on the known executed vulnerability list, right? Is what we're seeing, like, is this asset, where does it sit and what does it do? Is it a safety system? what's the criticality of this asset in my environment? And then again, you go to the next step of, is this environment owned by me? Who owns this environment? There are several questions that you can ask yourself. And the five lenses is it's a simple walkthrough. It's something you can grab. It's actually in our report from earlier this year that talks about how to actually look at this in your own environment so that you can prioritize it yourself. Because quite frankly, a CVSS score of 9.8 is critical, right? That's something that most people would patch immediately. But a CVSS score, let's say of a 9, requires user interaction, a physical person at keyboard interacting with something. And this particular environment that has this vulnerability is a physically secured site segmented with no one on site and no remote access. Is that really critical anymore? It's not to say that it's not worth considering or knowing about. You need to know these things. But is that something that should be worrying, some poor guy in the SOC or some poor operator trying to figure out what he has to patch next and which vendor he has to chase down? No, we could deprioritize that. Let that be a next, or maybe it's even a never, depending on what that site is and how locked down it is. And I have a really good, this isn't a vulnerability per se, but it's a threat. We have a really great customer who has had an ancient threat, it's Beagle, in one of their environments for like 17 years. Doesn't affect the operation. The environment is completely segmented off. Is it worth touching? And I think it's important, vulnerability or threat, that we ask ourselves. That is the biggest thing. How does this affect my environment? So I know I've gone on a little bit here, but to go back to the CVSS score, they're useful for a quick guide, and they apply a little bit more in IT, but I would still say IT can use the 5 lenses to understand, do I need to patch this next or something else?
So in the IT world and in software, where you could have a single file in a library that has a CVE against it, but you would say, well, it's in my library, and freak out, even though it never runs, never in the runtime. So is there an equivalent in the OT world?
We're talking almost like SBOMs. It literally could, you could have that library could be loaded, but from a security stance, it cannot be executed on. Or maybe so locked down you can't get to that function. That does happen. And actually, it's a little bit more difficult because you're getting into a nuanced area where either your team has to have the ability to go out and assess this, working with the vendor, or you need to have a third party come in and do an engagement.
Okay, where I'm going with these new AI-found vulnerabilities is that they're just looking at the code. They're not actually looking at what's running, and they don't have that real-world perspective. To an AI, it's just code. And so we're going to see a lot of these false positives. And I'm thinking in the IT software space, but also mapping that over to the OT space, where you could already have 100 false positives to wade through now, and then you've just been handed another 100 from AI. Thank you, Mythos and others. But how does the industry really absorb that? How do they even start to filter that?
So I think this, I would pivot a little in the sense that it's a great question, but I think we could broaden it and actually say cybersecurity in general and practitioners. And I talk about this a lot, so I apologize. Knock me off my soapbox if you need to. From an AI perspective, AI is amazing. A lot of folks don't understand how it functions. It is a consensus engine. So if there is no consensus on that topic, it can't really talk about that. It doesn't innovate. It does consensus. And as we all know, most of that consensus came from the internet, and the internet doesn't really have a lot of consensus. So it makes it difficult in certain areas. But when it comes to AI doing these things, I always find it interesting. You can look at the way the press talks about Mythos and Glasswing and how it's just absolutely producing all of these vulnerabilities. And you can go and look at Anthropic's own press releases and find that researchers were involved to verify those CVEs. They had to be, right? And that's an important flow, is the human in the loop. And I think some people miss that because it's honestly, it's hidden. It's not their fault. It just gets picked. The story gets picked up and run off on its own. So I like to go back to what you're saying is absolutely true. Having a fully automated agentic, we'll say agentic AI research team that's spitting out vulnerabilities is not a great idea. It's not capable of that yet, right? Maybe in the future. But what I am seeing, and this is incredibly important, is whether you're OT cybersecurity, you're IT cybersecurity, or an analyst or a researcher, the fact is we are all going to have to learn cross-disciplinary skills. We're going to be expanding our horizons. You can no longer just be a vulnerability researcher. You also need to be a vulnerability researcher and an AI power user. You have to know how to use these tools. And so I talk, again, I say this a lot. It's foundations first, then AI. So if they have the foundations, they can use agentic AI and AI to be a force multiplier for themselves and their output and their efficiency and what they've done. But only if they understand how AI works and how to utilize AI. And I see this for any practitioner out there today. I would say you need to focus on the foundation. Don't jump into AI to help you understand how to do vulnerability research. Understand vulnerability research and then understand how to utilize large language models and maybe even agents, and then take your knowledge of vulnerability research and just amplify everything that you're outputting. Because something that we see often is that it's not that a junior AI can take a junior engineer and make them senior or give them senior tasks. They take a junior engineer and shape the output like it's senior. That is a big contextual difference. It's not doing all the things that a senior person would do to check. It's using that consensus. It's making a junior's opinion look like it's a senior opinion. And if you were to break down those individual pieces, you can often find errors. You need to know enough about the output to interrogate AI or keep it within bounds.
So this is a topic that Jori's been thinking about and writing about lately. He's been in the OT space long enough to see some dangerous signs emerging and some parallels.
So AI tools today, we're getting better at being able to actually put them on site. So it's completely agentic. It's locked down to the site itself. There's no outside cloud coverage. We are getting better at that. But the majority of tools that you see utilizing AI are actually utilizing models that are in the cloud. And that frightens me for the same reason that running your SCADA systems in the cloud does. If you have we're talking about the need for reconnaissance in these environments. If you have all of your systems in the cloud, it's one big, beautiful target to go after. It's a lot harder to hack individual locations over and over and over again, trying to find out all those individual pieces. It is a fear of mine, which is, I love the cloud in general, but when I start thinking about how it applies to OT, we need to be very, very careful because it is not the keys to the kingdom. It's the whole kingdom at that point you are giving away. So if a threat actor can find a loophole or get in or even just steal credentials from your own employees to get access to that cloud, they then have access to whatever that employee did, that whole system. And if we're getting into the actual SCADA itself, it's very easy to tell what's in that environment, how it's operating, versus having to go in and sniff around a network and figure it out on your own. It becomes easier. So I worry about the implications of, like, the threat implications of putting an entire process, no matter what industry it's in the cloud.
In episode 38, I talked about the security of running SCADA systems in the cloud. Does that worry the energy industry?
In the energy space, there's only 2 instances that I know of that run anything close to that in a privatized cloud version. And they're both test environments for large utilities. Most utilities, especially with NERC CIP, you get into some interesting issues. So NERC CIP actually has this bulk electric service, BES. We call it BESI. Bulk electric service components cannot be in the cloud, meaning that not even their information. Like as a monitor, like a monitoring company comes in and they're monitoring east and west, you have that IDS. They can't store, that device's IP address and its host name in the cloud, you're breaking regulation right there.
Yep.
So until that changes, or we find a way to do that safely, I don't see it in the electrical space. When we talk about other things, manufacturing, absolutely.
So, AI really wasn't the original topic for this conversation in this episode. Originally, we were just going to talk about a set of regs that are coming down from the folks at NERC and how they've given them a 2-year window for the energy systems to come up to compliance. So, why don't we talk a little bit about NERC CIP 15, what it is and what it's hoping to address?
So CIP 15 is NERC's new rule for OT environments that really focuses on internal network security monitoring, which you'll hear me say INSM. That's what I mean is internal network security monitoring. It's designed to at least from a regulated space perspective, push tenants around monitoring out to each level in the Purdue model, whether it's 3.5 all the way down to level 1.
I should probably take a step back. And for people who don't know about the Purdue models, it's got like 5 or 6 levels, depending on who you ask.
Purdue was originally put in place to be like a best practices reference architecture for an environment, similar to what we see with IEC 62443. Both of them are around segmentation and how you divide these things out. But over time, Purdue has become something that we utilize in the OT industry as a reference model. It's how we speak to each other cross-organization or even internal to an organization about where a device sits, not necessarily how it is on the network. So in that reference model, we usually go top down when we speak about Purdue. So levels 4 and 5, I'm just going to condense those together. That's IT. It's what you traditionally think of as IT systems, your servers, your workstations, all that good stuff. There is actually a 3.5. That is a DMZ normally, depending on how you're constructed, but there's usually a DMZ between your IT and your OT. So that's 3.5. 3 is where you have most of your control. So this would be your control rooms where things are going on. This is where your historian's going to live. A lot of your telemetry is going to come back to, and it's going to be where your management systems live. We go down to level 2. This is where operators normally interact with the environment. So you'll have HMIs or human machine interfaces, workstations. They're here, along with some other systems, control systems that are there as well. And then level 1, this is where the process normally takes place. So there actually is a level 0, which we'll talk about in a second. But level 1 is where your programmable logic controllers are, your remote telemetry units are. Those are things that are actually taking directions from either a program or directions that come in over the network, and they're translating that to electrical signals, I/O, to an actual device. That and 0, that's where that device sits. That's where those valves are. That's where relays sit, et cetera, depending on what you're dealing with. So the area that touches network, the first one for that is level 1, and that's where most of the operation takes place. Now, to talk about level 6, we don't talk about cloud and OT very often. So they've kind of recently, last probably 4 or 5 years, they've started talking about level 6 being cloud. Yeah. But it's still so small of a percentage of folks who are adopting cloud that actually interacts with level 1 and level 2. It depends on who you talk to if they think a Purdue model has six levels. But those are the levels.
Getting back to CIP 15, when I first looked at it, and I'm not a practitioner in this space, but when I looked at it, it seemed to me that it was more about compliance and incident response. Maybe that's too high of a view. Is it more detailed than that?
I don't believe so. I think it is actually just putting some foundational rules in, and they're really just large buckets around how you would comply and respond in these environments. And it actually breaks down that way. There's 3 major areas. So it's CIP 15 is monitor and retain and protect it's R1, R2, and R3. R1 breaks out though into further out into monitor, detect, and evaluate. And when you think about the way you just outlined that as being compliance and response, it very much aligns with
I
that.
would imagine that companies are already doing some of these things today. Or is it more about figuring out what the language says and then mapping it to their compliance?
It's going to be a little bit of both. It depends on where they are in their maturity journey when it comes to cybersecurity and monitoring in their OT environment. You have folks who have spent time putting in, network detection response or NDR, intrusion detection response, IDS style tools, and they have those deployed today. But what we find is often over 80% of the organizations that have those tools have only deployed them at level 3 and level 3.5. So there's still some expansion that has to take place if they are regulated by CIP 15, where they'll need to deploy in levels 1 and levels 2 in the Purdue model as well. So I could see this being some expansion, but for those that have a very mature model today and are monitoring throughout Purdue level 1 through 3.5, it's they're ahead of the curve, right? They've already got it in there. But honestly we find that to be a very, at least who we work with, it's a small percentage that has all of that today.
And another definition here. NERC is a collection of energy interests. It's not a government entity. It extends even into Canada, if I understand correctly. And it's a body that self-regulates the energy industry.
Yeah, it's if my numbers may be dated, but it's like 400. It's like 400 entities, and it is across North America. It is Canada and the U.S. that all work together. And normally, when you definitely have you have a board that's put together that's or a team that's actually going out and looking at these particular things and trying to write. And they usually check in with practitioners inside those entities. So depending on how involved your organization wants to be, you can be quite involved in CIP and seeing how things are drafted and affecting what comes out in CIP protocols like this.
So as an analogy, it's kind of like the PCI regulating credit card industries and so forth.
I believe so. I think there's a little bit more bite behind it though when it comes to critical infrastructure. But that's about as far as I can say. I don't know exactly how that goes together.
Some of these SIPs, the fact that the members themselves are bubbling these things up.
There's that some is how some things take place, and I don't know what the percentages are, but you also have outside forces that are coming in as well. In the last administration was really pushing for critical infrastructure. We had the 100-day bill, but that critical infrastructure policy really forced a lot of what you're seeing now. CIP 15 was a response. This is coming in other ways, right? And it's being laid out in legislation, and I feel like CIP 15 is part of the response to that particular policy. So there's definitely outside forces coming in from a regulatory sense, but yes, I think it is these individual entities and the market as a whole answering those outside pressures.
So, like any regulation, there's a lot of latitude here.
I'm actually wonder for you as a host how annoying this next comment will be, but the basics are where we all need to start. Segmentation is so important inside these organizations. So if I was to harp on things, it's actually proper segmentation and visibility in the environment. Now, CIP 15 is focused on extending that visibility, so I think it's helpful. But I actually talk about this a lot, and sometimes I get some flack, but I call it compliance theater. You can check every single one of these boxes from the compliance game, right? So you've won the compliance game, and I call it theater because you still don't have visibility, nor is it affecting your day-to-day operations. And the whole goal behind compliance really is to try and enact good security process and procedures. At least we hope. If it's beyond that, that's a fight we're going to have to take on our own. But yeah, here I am. I'm talking about CIP 15. I can also see areas where CIP has missed the mark, whether it's CIP 15 or CIP 8 or some of the other CIPs where you can see the intent behind what the regulation's trying to do, but they just missed the mark, or that particular version of CIP may not have had as many asset owners involved. And so it seems like a great idea, but in practice, it can't be implemented in the way it needs to be. So all these things need to be iterated on, right? They're constantly growing, constantly changing forms. And so I hope that we do keep growing towards these things. I do want to comment too as well that this really CIP 15, you had talked about it being about a 2-year window. That's specifically for high impact and some medium impact CIP, which is externally routable. We call them ERCs. That is the date is 2028. But for most medium, just CIP medium impact facilities, it doesn't have to be in place until 2030. The question I often get though, and I tell people to prepare for it, is how long until CIP low is also included in this? I could see that being an addition sometime around 2028 or shortly thereafter.
So going back to our OT concerns around putting it all in the cloud and having a post-Mythos vulnerability flood to exploit the cloud in older systems, maybe we should exclude OT from the cloud altogether. And not necessarily the cloud, but newer technologies that are coming along that might need for OT to go a little bit slower so that it stays more secure, given that we're talking about critical infrastructure. We're not messing around. Human lives can be on the line. So we don't want to adopt the latest trend in technology. We say, no, we're OT, and we're just going to be fine where we are. Thank you.
Yes, this is where you hear like Industry 4.0, right? Industry 5.0. That's where we in OT have to start pivoting to think of how can we utilize these things in a safe fashion. And a lot of that is going to be infrastructure refreshes, hardware refreshes, along with the tooling that we're talking about putting in, like CIP 15 is requiring, the tooling to be able to actually defend that environment and monitor it. There's more work that needs to be done. And because of the age of these environments, we often talk about legacy systems, security, they're not, security wasn't a part of the plan. That's not wrong. 30 years ago, we weren't thinking about this.
Right.
30 years ago, I would not have told you that I was going to have agentic AI agents that are doing work for me in a lab. Like, I would have never even thought that. I would have thought that, Skynet would have taken over before that happened. It blows my mind. And it's one of the reasons I love being in technology. So I think we are going to have to run behind. But I do think that OT, and this falls to the vendors, especially those that are building solutions for our critical infrastructure, we need to get a little bit better about looking ahead. It's not a 5-year plan, it's not a 10-year plan. If we could do 15, if we could have some outlooks of how we're going to get out there and how we can future-proof the devices that we're making. I think we are getting, honestly, there's vendors that are getting very good at future-proofing. What I mean is, they have enough resources to be able to upgrade things, to have other utilities. They're starting to include, instead of just real-time operating systems, they're very locked down traditional operating systems that could support, like an endpoint client. There's a lot of moving towards that. I think we just need to get a little better.
I'd like to thank Jori VanAntwerp of Ember OT for returning to the show. He always has a unique insight, and he's definitely one to watch and listen to in the OT world. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts, and I'd really like to hear from you. Go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I've got some great episodes coming up. We'll have more on Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and hacking utilities supply chains. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.